The chamber was built to make visitors feel small. That was not an accident. The Galactic Conclave had been designing rooms for 300 years, and in 300 years, they had learned one thing above all. Others, the right ceiling height could do more diplomatic work than a fleet of warships. The Conclave Hall on Drakesea Prime soared 40 m from polished floor to vaulted ceiling, every surface carved from pale stone quarried on worlds that no longer existed, lit by floating panels that cast a light just slightly too cold for human eyes. The delegate tables fanned out in a wide arc around the central floor, each one raised just a little higher than the one before it, so that whoever stood at the center looked up at everyone around them. Humans had been standing at the center for a long time. Admiral Sarah Voss walked in and did not look up. She was not a tall woman. She was not a particularly impressive woman by the standards of species that measured such things in size or ornamentation. She wore a plain gray uniform with no medals on it. She owned medals. She had simply chosen not to bring them, and she carried a single flat case under one arm. Her hair was cut short and had gone mostly silver. Her face had the particular quality of someone who had stopped being surprised by things some years ago and had not yet decided whether that was a loss. Behind her came two aides. They also wore plain uniforms. They also did not look up at the tiered galleries. The chamber was full. Word had circulated that humanity's delegation had arrived with a senior military officer rather than a diplomatic team, and that had drawn interest. 50 species represented, hundreds of observers in the upper galleries, the scratching of translation devices, and the low hum of atmospheric systems designed for a dozen different breathing requirements. Counselor VTH of the Drakesea was already seated at the head of the arc. He was a large being by most measures, broad across the chest, skin the color of old amber, eyes that caught light the way water did. He had run conclave diplomatic affairs for 30 years. He had negotiated the Helios Compact. He had in that time dealt with humanity in various forms of agitation, and he had learned that humanity's agitation was mostly noise. They complained, they threatened, they eventually came around. He watched Voss walk to the center floor and waited for her to arrange her materials, call up a display, begin the familiar ritual of counter-proposals and grievance lists and requests for amendments to language in such the conclave would never actually change. She did not call up a display. She set the flat case on the speaking table. She opened it. She took out a single physical document, actual printed material, rare enough in this room to draw a murmur from the galleries, and she placed it on the table facing outward. Then she stepped back from the table. She did not speak. VTH waited. This was clearly a rhetorical opening. Some kind of theater. He had seen human theater before. The silence stretched. One of his aides leaned toward him and whispered that the human admiral had not registered a speaking request, had not filed a formal agenda, had not submitted credentials for the session. She had simply arrived, placed the document in, was now standing with her hands behind her back, looking at nothing in particular. VTH activated the center floor's document reader. The text appeared on every screen in the chamber simultaneously. The title read Accounting. Below it was a list. It began with the Helios Compact of 2271 and the resource tariffs written into subsection 14 that had over 40 years extracted the equivalent of 8 trillion standard credits from human colonial infrastructure. It moved through the Mira Station incident of 2289, in which human petition for emergency medical supply access during a colony plague had been tabled for 7 months by conclave procedural process. While 11,000 people died, it covered the boundary revision of 2301, in which human settled space had been quietly redrawn to exclude 3 mineral-rich systems without consultation or compensation. It moved through trade agreement after trade agreement, each one written by conclave members with human delegates present but not participating in the actual drafting, each one using the language of mutual benefit to describe arrangements that were mutual in no meaningful way. The list was long, it was specific. Every item had dates, session numbers, names of presiding conclave officers, and an attached value in resources, in lives in territory, in the slower and harder to quantify cost of a species that had spent 3 centuries learning to make itself acceptable in rooms not built for them. The last item on the list was dated 3 weeks ago, a human colony's appeal for water reclamation rights on a planet they had terraformed and settled over 60 years had been denied on the grounds that the aquifer system fell within a resource zone claimed by a DRA commercial entity that had registered the claim 4 years prior and had not yet acted on it. The colony had 14,000 residents. The Draxi commercial entity had 3 administrators and no active operations. At the very bottom of the document, below the last item, below the totals, below the dates and the names and the numbers, was a single line: this table is closed, no signature, no delegation. Stamp, no request for response. Boss picked up the empty case, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of the chamber. Her 2 aides followed. The door closed behind them, not slammed, not left opened, just closed with the ordinary sound of a door closing, which somehow landed in that enormous room like something far louder. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the chamber erupted. Draxi delegates called for a formal censure. The Keth representatives demanded clarification of the documents. Legal standing, 3 different species. Delegations began cross-talking in the galleries. VTH sat very still in his chair and looked at the last line of the document still displayed on his screen. This table is closed. He had seen human frustration before. He had seen human anger, human pride, human stubbornness. He had not seen this. This was not anger. Anger wanted a response. This had not waited for one. He told his aides to prepare a formal reply requesting an emergency renegotiation session. Standard language, acknowledgement of concerns raised, offer of meaningful discussion. In the second gallery in a seat she had been assigned as an observer rather than a full delegate. Cesar of the Velhari was not talking to anyone around her. She was small, even by Velhari standards, pale, 4-limbed, with wide dark eyes that tended to unsettled species unused to irises that large. She had spent the last 12 years studying human history, not recent history, old history, the long kind. Centuries of it. She had read their wars and their peaces and their wars again, and the specific pattern that ran through all of it like a thread pulled tight. She was reading the document on her screen and she was not moving. One of the other Valhari observers leaned toward her and said that it was probably just posturing. Humans always came back to the table eventually. They needed the trade networks too much. They were too practical to actually walk away. Cesara did not respond right away. She kept looking at the document. Then she said, "They terraformed that planet 60 years ago. They built the water system themselves. They applied for the rights through proper channels and were denied in favor of a shell claim." She paused. "That colony has 14,000 people and they cannot access the water under their own ground." The other observer said yes, and it was regrettable, but these things were addressed through the proper process. Cesara looked at him. The proper process put that item on a list that ended with "This table is closed." She looked back at the screen. "They are not posturing." She requested an emergency session with the Conclave Security Council that afternoon. She filed the request through proper channels, attached her research on human historical conflict patterns, and included a summary argument that ran pages. The session was granted a preliminary review date of 6 weeks out. On Earth, in the Unified Defense Command building in what used to be Geneva, Director Caro was standing at a window when the confirmation came through that Voss's delegation had departed Draxi Prime. He was a lean man in his 60s with the kind of face that looked like it had been left in difficult weather for a long time. He had been in this building for 20 years. He had sat in on every failed negotiation, every amended treaty, every session where humanity's delegates came home having traded something they couldn't afford for something they didn't need. His aide told him the document had been received and read into the record. Marrero nodded. He kept looking out the window. The city was ordinary below him. Traffic and weather and people who did not know that 6 hours ago their admiral had placed a list on a table on another planet and walked away from it. He asked if Voss was in transit. His aide confirmed she was on her way back. No communications during travel as instructed. Good. Marrow turned from the window. He had work to do. The silence was already beginning, and there was a great deal to do inside it. 300 years of sitting at other people's tables had given humanity one advantage that no one had bothered to account for. They had spent 300 years watching how the game was played while they built quietly in their own space, with their own people, the things that mattered when the game was finished. Silence would look like grief to the Conclave. It would look like a species sulking, processing, running the calculations, preparing to come back to the table with their hat in their hands, and a more acceptable list of concessions led them think that. Marrero sat down at his desk, opened the first of many files. The work was long and it was good, and it had been a long time coming. Outside the window, the city went about its business, ordinary and unhurried. 14,000 people on a colony called Mira's Reach were drawing water today from a system they had built themselves on a world they had grown from bare rock, and the water tasted like iron because the filtration needed maintenance they couldn't afford. After 40 years of tariffs, and they were doing this for the last time under those conditions. They didn't know that yet. They would. Far out in the dark between stars, Admiral Voss sat in the forward cabin of the transit ship and watched the stars and did not think about the room she had just left. She thought about the colony. She thought about the list. She had read every item on that list before it was printed, had checked Every figure had spent a long time making sure that what was written was accurate and fair and said exactly what it meant and nothing extra. She did not feel victorious. She did not feel relieved. She felt the way a person feels when they have finally, after a very long time, stopped doing something that was hurting them. Clear she was. Very clear. The stars did not move outside her window, the way stars never move when you are moving toward them. And the ship carried her home through the silence she had started, and behind her on Draxi Prime, VTH was drafting a reply to a table that was no longer there. The first message went unanswered. On a Tuesday, that was not unusual. Human diplomatic channels had response windows of up to 72 standard hours, a quirk of their administrative structure that the Conclave had long since stopped finding offensive. Bates' office sent the formal reply acknowledgement of the document offer of emergency renegotiation, language carefully chosen to suggest the Conclave was taking the concern seriously without actually conceding anything, and settled into wait. 72 hours passed, then another 72. The auto-acknowledgement system that human diplomatic relay stations always ran, the simp automated ping that said message received, response pending, was also silent. That was unusual. That system ran continuously. It had been running for 60 years without interruption. Bates' senior aide flagged it. Bate told him to send a follow-up through the secondary channel. The secondary channel was also silent. By the end of the first month, the Conclave had sent 11 messages across 4 different communication channels and received no response to any of them. Human diplomatic mission on Draxi Prime. A small building with 6 staff members and a garden that the staff maintained with what Vet had always privately considered excessive care was locked, not abandoned. The garden had been watered recently. The lights ran on their automated cycle, but no one came to the door and no one responded to the intercom, and the 6 staff members were simply not present. VTH convened a closed session of the Conclave's inner council and told them this was a negotiating posture. He had seen it before, not from humans specifically, but from species that wanted to manufacture urgency to make the other side feel the weight of the silence and come forward with better terms. It was a known technique. It worked sometimes on less experienced diplomatic bodies. Conclave was not a less experienced diplomatic body. They would wait. Humans needed trade. Humans needed the network access. The Conclave controlled the transit corridors, the shared infrastructure of a civilization that spanned 400 inhabited systems. A species did not simply opt out of that. There was no opting out. The Conclave was not a club you left. It was the shape of the galaxy. VTH said this with confidence because he believed it. The inner council agreed because it was easier than the alternative. 3 weeks into the second month, a Draxi patrol vessel called the Honored Descent was assigned to run a standard presence loop near the human border, not a provocation. The patrol route existed on charts going back 40 years, running through a corridor that had been Conclave designated space since before the Helios Compact. The Honor Descent had run the route 17 times in the past 2 years. Without incident, it crossed into the corridor and dropped off sensors, not off sensors entirely, not destroyed. Honor Descent continued to emit its Standard transponder signal still. Moving, still functional by every external reading, but its communications were silent, and when a follow-up patrol was sent 3 days later to investigate, they found the honored ascent drifting at zero thrust in open space, running on minimum power, all crew present in unharmed, sitting in the dark. The crew was physically fine. They were also extremely quiet. They had the look of people who had seen something. They were still processing. The medical team found no injuries, no signs of boarding, no environmental anomaly. The ship's hull was intact. The crew's equipment was intact. Their food supplies were intact. Their personal items were intact. Every weapon system on the ship had been removed. Not damaged, not destroyed. Removed cleanly, completely, with no damage to surrounding systems. The weapons bays were empty. The point defense arrays were empty. The torpedo racks were empty. Whatever had been in those spaces had been extracted with a precision that suggested either technology the Conclave had not encountered or a level of patience and care that was in its own way more unsettling than destruction would have been. Attached to the outer hull, secured with a standard adhesive rated for vacuum conditions, was a flat panel on it in 17 languages, every language spoken by Conclave member species, plus 4 additional languages that belonged to species who were not Conclave members. Was a single message: we are not ready yet, do not come back. The Inner Council met in emergency session within hours of the report reaching Draxi Prime. The session was not calm. The Kai delegate argued that this was an act of war and should be treated as one. The Mora delegate argued that an act of war required clarification of intent, and the message was ambiguous. Several delegates argued simultaneously about what not ready yet meant. Ready for what? Ready to negotiate, ready to fight, ready to re-engage with the Conclave system. The phrase sat in the room and refused to be comfortable. VTH sat at the head of the table and let them argue for a while. Then he called for quiet. He said the situation was serious but controllable. The removal of the patrol vessels' weapons was a demonstration, a message, not an attack. If humanity had wanted to destroy the ship, they would have destroyed it. The restraint was deliberate, and the deliberateness was paradoxically reassuring. It meant humanity was still communicating, still interested in the Conclave understanding something. He said he would escalate to a full diplomatic convoy, 12 ships, 4 species, a formal offer of renegotiation with meaningful concessions on the table, something humanity could take home and call a victory. That was what they needed, a way to end the silence without losing face. Give them something real, let them claim it. Everyone moves on. It was a reasonable plan. It was in fact the kind of plan that had worked before with other species and other standoffs. At the far end of the table, the Velhari observer seat was occupied by Cesara. She had been granted full observer status after her emergency session request had been partially reviewed and partially approved, not the Security Council session she had requested, but a standing invitation to Inner Council meetings related to the human situation, which was a lesser thing dressed up as a greater one. She had accepted it because she had no other option. She had been sitting quietly through the entire session. When Bate finished laying out the convoy plan, she raised a hand. VTH nodded at her. Courtesy, he expected questions about logistics. She said, I would like to present the research I submitted 6 weeks ago, which the council has not yet formally reviewed. Bates said there would be time for that. Right now the priority was the operational response, Sarah said. The operational response is what I need to discuss. Then Bates gestured for her to continue. She pulled up her materials. They filled the rooms. Display surfaces, charts, timelines, historical records pulled from human archives that were, she noted, publicly available. Anyone could have accessed them. No one had considered them relevant. She began with the wars. Humans had a history of conflict that was by conclave standards extraordinary in its density. In the period before they achieved interstellar capacity, they had fought wars nearly continuously, not the controlled, interest-bounded territorial conflicts most species eventually settled into, but wars that consumed their entire civilizations, that rewrote maps and languages and entire ways of organizing their societies. They had developed weapons capable of ending all life on their own planet, and then remarkably had not used them, not because they lacked the will, but because the threat of mutual destruction had created a standoff that held barely for long enough that they had grown past it. What this meant, Cesar explained, was that humans had a relationship with a concept of total war that no conclave species shared. Other species fought to establish dominance, to secure resources, to enforce treaties. They fought with ends in mind, and when the ends were achieved or became unreachable, they stopped. It was rational. It was how sentient beings managed conflict. Humans fought differently, not always, not by default. Humans were in fact extraordinarily patient and remarkably willing to absorb poor treatment for long periods of time. She showed the historical record on that too, the decades and centuries of subjugated human populations that had endured conditions that would have produced immediate violent response in most conclave species. But in this was the part she needed the council to understand. The patience was not infinite, and it was not the same thing as acceptance. Humans remembered. Humans kept lists. She paused for just a moment when she said that, and let the reference to Voss's document sit in the room without explaining it. When humans decided that the situation was not going to improve through endurance, they did not escalate gradually. They did not send signals and test responses and adjust. They prepared quietly for as long as it took, and then they committed completely. She showed them 3 historical examples from Earth's pre-Kant period. She did not embellish them. The numbers spoke well enough on their own. Then she said, the silence is not a negotiating posture. The silence is preparation. The message on the hull of the Honor descent was not a threat. It was accurate information. They are not ready yet. They will be ready at a time of their choosing. When they are ready, they will act, and the action will not look like anything we are planning for. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been before. VTH said, describing a species deciding to go to war with the conclave. Sarah said, I'm describing a species that decided some time ago and is currently in the process of becoming ready. VTH said, on what basis? We have offered renegotiation. We have acknowledged the document. We have you tabled their medical petition for 7 months while 11,000 people died. Sura said. She said it without heat. just the words. You reclassified their water rights to benefit a shell company with no active operations. You have done this consistently in one form or another for 40 years. The document they placed on your table was not a request. It was a record filed before something. Not during a negotiation. She let that sit. Then she said, I am asking the council not to send the convoy. VTH looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked around the table. He saw what she saw, that several delegates were shaken, that the argument had landed in some rooms it had not landed before. He also saw that changing course now publicly in response to what was essentially research presentation from a junior observer would read as capitulation, would signal weakness to every member species watching the conclave manage. This situation would validate the human position in ways that could destabilize other arrangements with other species who had their own lists. He said her concerns were noted and would be taken seriously. He said the convoy would proceed. Sarah closed her display material slowly. She looked at her hands for a moment, then she looked up at the room, the long table, the important faces, the chamber built for exactly this kind of decision, and she said nothing else. She had said what she came to say. She had said it clearly and with evidence. She had given them the thing they needed to avoid what was coming. They had taken the thing she gave them and put it in a drawer. The convoy left Drax Prime 12 days later, 12 ships for species, a formal offer of renegotiation with real concessions written into it. This time, VTH had made sure of that. Restoration of the water rights on Mira's Reach, a review committee for the Helios Compact tariff structure, a formal apology in careful diplomatic language that apologized without admitting specific fault for the delays. In the medical petition of 2289, real things, meaningful things, things that offered 2 months ago might have changed the shape of the conversation. The convoy entered human designated space through the standard transit corridor. The navigator called out contacts on sensors, then more contacts. Then the navigator stopped calling them out individually because there were too many and they were everywhere ahead, flanking above and below the corridor. Planes sitting in the dark and not moving, just present in numbers that did not match anything the convoys' intelligence files said humanity could feel. The convoys led it a communication channel. Admiral Voss's voice came back immediately. She said, you have 60 seconds to turn around. The convoy's lead diplomat opened his mouth to begin the formal greeting sequence, the established protocol for opening renegotiation contact. The words VTH had personally reviewed and approved and believed in. He had 53 seconds left. He started talking. The diplomat's name was Counselor Finn of the Mora. He was experienced, 31 years in conclave diplomatic service. He had negotiated ceasefire terms between species that communicated through chemical signals and species that communicated through seismic vibration. He had sat in rooms where the air was wrong for his lungs and eaten food that made him ill and smiled through both because that was the work and he believed in the work. He was not a man who panicked. He had 49 seconds and he used the first 3 of them to find his footing, which was admirable under the circumstances, and then he said, Admir Voss, I am Counselor Finn of the Mora, representing the Galactic Conclave in this diplomatic Contact, we come with a formal offer of renegotiation with material concessions, already written and endorsed by the full Inner Council, including restoration of water rights for the Mira's Reach colony, a formal review of the Helios compact tariff structure, and an official. Voss said 40 seconds, then said, Admiral, I understand there is significant grievance here, and I want you to know the Conclave takes that grievance seriously. The offer on the table is genuine. These are real concessions, not language. I am asking for the opportunity to present them formally so that Voss said 30 seconds. Fenn looked at the sensor display on his right. The contacts had not moved, hundreds of them sitting in the dark around the corridor like they had been there for years. His navigator was running identification protocols, and the protocols were returning almost nothing, not because the ships were hidden, but because the ship profiles did not match anything in the Conclave's database. New designs, things that had not existed in any intelligence file. He had 20 seconds, and he made a decision. He said, Admir, please, we have an apology on the table for the medical petition 2289. 11,000 lives. The Conclave is acknowledging. Boss said the channel stayed open. That was the thing she did not close it. She left it open, which Fenn understood a moment later was not mercy but instruction. She wanted him to hear everything that happened next. What happened next took 11 minutes. Later, when Fenn wrote his report, he would spend a long time trying to find the right words for those 11 minutes and would eventually conclude that no words were adequate and that the attempt to find them was itself a kind of avoidance. He would write the technical description instead. It was cleaner. 43 human vessels moved out of their holding positions in a pattern that, when later reconstructed from sensor logs, looked less like a military maneuver and more like a mathematical proof. Each ship moving to a specific position relative to a specific target. No wasted motion, no adjustment, as if the positions had been calculated and preloaded, and all that was required was execution. The first thing the Conclave ships experienced was a loss of long-range communication, not jamming. Jamming was a broad, noisy interference that you could identify and sometimes push through. This was targeted. Each ship's specific communication array went offline in sequence in order of priority, the most powerful array first. Whatever was doing it knew exactly which systems were which. The second thing was a loss of navigation. The third thing was the weapons. Fenn's ship, the convoy flagship, had its defense systems addressed last. He watched on internal displays as the outlying Conclave ships went from full operational status to something the display described as minimal power, non-critical systems. Only in the space of minutes the ships were not destroyed, they were not boarded, they continued to drift. Life support intact, crew unharmed, every comfort system still running, just stripped quietly and completely of anything that made them a threat. When it reached Fenn's ship, he had time to walk to the viewport. He saw a human vessel outside, close enough that he could make out the detail on the hull. It was moving alongside his ship at matching speed, doing what it was doing to his weapon systems, and it was not a large vessel. It was not, by the visible evidence, a capital ship of any kind. It was doing this with what appeared to be relatively modest hardware. That was the part that stayed with him, not the scale. Of it the ease, when it was done when all 12 conclave ships in the convoy were sitting quiet and stripped in the corridor, Voss came back on the channel. She said, "Your crews are unharmed, your life support, food supply and medical systems are operating normally, your engines are operating normally, you can go home." A pause. "We left your communications intact. Tell VTE what you saw." Fenn said, "Is noted." Voss said, "The water rights, the tariff review, the apology." Another pause shorter. "If the apology had come with the petition 2289, 11,000 people would have lived. If the tariff review had come in 2271, when we asked for it, 8 trillion credits would still be in our colonies. The offer is what you had to give when you had nothing left to threaten us with. We know the difference." Fenn did not have an answer to that. He did not think there was an answer to that. Voss said, "Go home, counselor." The channel closed on Drakesea Prime. VTH received the convoy's report in his private office, read it twice, and then sat with it for a long time. The thing that he kept returning to was not the weapons removal. The weapons removal was tactically impressive and deeply alarming, but it was at least a thing he could file in a category: superior technology or superior intelligence on conclave systems, or some combination of both. Unsettling but categorizable. What he could not categorize was the ease. 43 ships, 12 targets, 11 minutes. No hesitation, no adjustment, no sign that any of this had required unusual effort. He called his intelligence director and asked a direct question based on what they knew of human military capacity as of 2 years ago. How long would it have taken them to develop the systems that had just been demonstrated? His intelligence director said she would need time to analyze the sensor data from the convoy before she could answer that. He said he wanted a preliminary estimate, not precise, rough. She was quiet for a moment, then she said that, based on the preliminary read of the sensor data, she did not believe the systems demonstrated were 2 years old. She believed they were significantly older. She said the precision and integration suggested long development cycles, extensive testing, mature technology. Veth said, "How old?" She said she didn't want to speculate without full analysis. He said, "Speculate." She said, "Decades at minimum." The session that convened 2 days later was the largest inter-council meeting in 30 years. Every senior delegate in the conclave system was present in person or by high-priority relay. The room was full in a way that rooms in the conclave hall were rarely full, every seat taken. Observers standing at the back, the atmosphere tight and closed. VTH presented the convoy report. He presented the sensor analysis. He presented the intelligence director's preliminary estimate. The chamber was quiet in the way that large rooms are quiet when everyone in them is thinking the same thing and no one wants to say it first. The KE senior delegate said it first. He said, "They've been building toward this for decades." VTH said, "That is the preliminary assessment." The KE delegate said, "While they were sitting at our tables." VTH said nothing. "While they were submitting petitions." The KE delegate said, "Filing appeals, signing compacts, sending delegates," who stood in the middle of this room and looked up at us. He stopped. The full weight of that settled over the chamber like weather. They were building. Cesara was in her observer seat at the end of the room. She had not been invited to this session she had attended anyway on the basis that her standing observer status had not been revoked and no one had stopped her because in the current atmosphere, no one was certain enough of anything to make a secondary decision about whether Velhari observer should be in the room. She was not taking notes, she already knew everything being said, what she was doing quietly behind her still expression was grieving, not for the conclave. The conclave had made its choices clearly and repeatedly and with full information, including the information she had given them. She was grieving for the shape of what could have been a different set of choices made at a different table at any of 100 points in the last 40 years. Water rights restored, a petition answered, a tariff reviewed, a species treated as what it was rather than what the room ceiling height was designed to make it feel like. Small things, any one of them might have been enough. None of them had been done. Bates said that the council needed to discuss a response, military option, conclave species fielding combined forces. The human military was impressive, but humanity was one species. The conclave was 400. Sarah raised her hand. No one acknowledged her. She said clearly into the room, before you discuss military options, I would suggest you confirm that the 400 species you intend to call on still consider themselves conclave members. The room turned toward her. She said, in the 3 months since the document was placed on this floor, I have been tracking a secondary signal that we have not yet formally discussed. 14 species have gone quiet, not human quiet. They are still responding to standard communications, but their trade activity has shifted. Their ship movements have shifted. There are new transit routes being used that do not appear on conclave charts. She paused. 3 of those species share a border with human space. 4 of them have long-standing disputes with conclave resource claims. The other 7 have various reasons I have documented in the research you have not yet read. She lit that land. Then she said, humanity did not spend 300 years at our tables only learning how to lose. They were also learning who else was losing. The room sat with that. Bates said, you're saying they've been building alliances. Sarah said, I'm saying that when you seat people at the children's table long enough, they start talking to each other. In the Unified Defense Command building in Geneva, Mara was on his 3rd coffee of the morning when his communications director knocked and entered without waiting, which meant it was not a normal message. She said that the convoy had returned and the conclave's intelligence traffic had gone up 900% in the last 48 hours, and every indication suggested they were moving toward a combined military response. Marrow said, good. She looked at him. He said they need to decide fast before they have time to think about it carefully. If they think about it carefully, they might actually look at who's still standing with them. He sat down his coffee. How's phase 2? She pulled up the status on her tablet. 41 of the 63 planned production facilities at full operational capacity, remaining 22 at 80% or higher. The allied species facilities, she listed them 7 names, 4 of which the conclave did not know were allied, running ahead of schedule in 3 cases. The new transit corridor network, the one that didn't appear on conclave charts, 61% complete. He nodded. He asked about Mira's reach specifically. She said the colony's new water infrastructure was 40% complete. Private Funding from the human diaspora routed through 3 intermediary channels, so it didn't flag on conclave monitoring. The colony didn't know where the funding had come from. They thought it was a private humanitarian organization. Marrow said, "When it's done, tell them where it came from," she said. "When it's done," he said after, "not before. I don't want them to feel like they owe us anything before they have." The water, she wrote that down. Marrow stood and walked to the window. Same view as always, ordinary city. He thought about the convoy. Voss's report had come through clean and spare, the way her reports always did. 11 minutes. All crews unharmed. They know what they saw. He thought about Finn of the Mora, standing at a viewport watching something his intelligence files said shouldn't exist. He thought about a room with a 40m ceiling and a light too cold for human eyes. He thought about how many years his people had stood in the center of that room looking up. Not anymore. He turned from the window. There was work to do, and it was good work, and the morning was ordinary, and the city below him went about its life, unhurried, unaware, and somewhere out in the black Voss was already moving to the next position. The conclave thought the demonstration was the message. The demonstration was not the message. The demonstration was the last warning. There would not be another one. Marrow picked up his coffee. He had a meeting in 10 minutes with the Velhari liaison. Not Sarah. She was still on Draxi Prime, and he hoped she was safe. About the final coordination of Phase 3. Phase 3 was not a warning. Phase 3 was the answer to 40 years of children's tables and iron-tasting water, and 11,000 people who had needed medicine and been given procedure instead. He went to his meeting. The conclave's war plan was called the Closed Fist. It had taken their combined military command 8 days to draft it, which was fast by conclave standards and reflected the genuine urgency of the situation. The plan was thorough. It was well-reasoned. It accounted for human aggression patterns drawn from 3 centuries of behavioral data, identified the most likely axes of human advance, and deployed the conclave's considerable combined fleet strength along those axes in layered defensive formations that would absorb any frontal push and then counterattack from multiple angles. It was by every measure they had a good plan. The humans did not come from the front. The first indication that something was wrong came not from a military installation, but from a logistics relay station at the edge of Draxi commercial space, mid-sized facility that handled cargo routing for about 9% of conclave internal trade. Unremarkable, the kind of installation that existed in the background of a civilization and was only noticed when it stopped working. It stopped working on a morning in late autumn by the Draxi calendar. Not destroyed, not attacked. It simply went offline, all systems simultaneously. And when the conclave sent a maintenance vessel to investigate, the maintenance vessel found the station intact and empty, and all of its routing tables rewritten to direct traffic away from conclave hub systems and toward a network of transit points that weren't on any conclave chart. The maintenance team flagged it as a cyber attack of unusual sophistication and sent for a technical response team. By the time the technical response team arrived, 6 more relay stations had gone offline in the same way. By the time the military command finished analyzing the pattern of the relay failures, they had fallen 17 installations behind. the closed fist, was a plan for stopping an army that came at you. It had no good answer for an army that walked around you and started quietly turning off the lights. The second indication was larger and came from 3 directions at once. On the edge of Velhari home space, a Draxi administrative station that had governed a Velhari colony for 80 years, woke up one morning to find 3 things. First, that its communications to Draxi Prime were being routed through an unfamiliar relay that introduced a 40-minute delay in each direction. Second, that 12 vessels of unfamiliar profile had taken up positions in the system that were technically not threatening but were also very clearly not going anywhere. And third, that the Velhari on the planet below, who had been quiet and cooperative for 8 decades, were no longer cooperating. They were not rioting. They were not burning anything. They were simply not reporting for the administrative processes that kept the colonial system running, the resource extraction schedules, the transit manifest, the labor allocation systems that the Draxi administration depended on to function. They had apparently and simultaneously decided to stop. Station commander sent an urgent message to Draxi Prime. It arrived 40 minutes late. The response arrived 40 minutes after that. By then the situation had been replicated on 2 other Velhari worlds under Draxi administration. The same pattern appeared on the same day among Keth settlements under Mora administrative control and among 3 Harathi communities in the outer systems who had been listed in conclave records as content. They were not content. They had simply been waiting. Commander Ree had been in the military for 11 years, and she had never been in a ground action before. Her background was logistics. She was good at the movement of things, at understanding how systems connected and where they were fragile, which was, she would come to understand exactly why she had been assigned to the Velhari operation rather than a fleet posting. She was on the ground on a colony called VTH's Margin, named with a particular irony of colonial naming practices after the counselor who had administered it most aggressively when the non-operation began. She was there as a liaison technically. In practice, she was there to help coordinate the things that needed coordinating when a colony stopped cooperating with its administrators and needed to keep functioning. Anyway, the colony had 112,000 Valari residents and an administrative staff of about 400 Draxi, mostly bureaucrats and technical personnel who were not, as far as anyone could determine, bad people. Individually, they were people doing a job in a system that happened to be extractive and had been for 80 years. Reed did not know what to do with that exactly, so she put it in a box and focused on what was in front of her. What was in front of her on the first morning was an elderly Valhari woman named Osa, who ran the colony's water distribution network and had been running it for 40 years and knew where pipe was and how every valve worked, and was in this moment the single most important person in a radius of about 300 km. Osa did not speak any human language. Ray did not speak Velhari. They had a translation device between them that handled vocabulary adequately but missed about 30% of idiomatic content, which meant their conversations had a particular texture, clear on facts, murky on everything else. Asa showed her the water network, showed her the maintenance schedules, showed her the 3 places in the system where Draxi administrative control interfaces intersected with the physical infrastructure, the choke points, the places where the old system could theoretically reassert itself if the administrative staff decided to try. Ray looked at those 3 points for a long time, then she asked through the translation device whether the Velhari technical team could isolate those interfaces. Asa looked at her. There was something in the look that Rai couldn't fully read, not hostility. Something more complicated. Then Asa said something and the device translated it as we could have done this at any time. Ray said, I know. Asa said something the device translated as why. Now, Ray thought about how to answer that. She thought about the document, the list, the specific item about the Mirror's Reach water rights, which she had read because everyone in the service had read it, which had landed differently for different people, but had landed for everyone, she said, because someone finally made the list. The device rendered it in Valhari. Asa looked at her for a moment, then she nodded and turned and called something to her team, and they started working. The Draxi administrative staff on VTH's margin did not attempt to use force. Ray had been told to expect that they might, and had a contingency prepared. But in the event, the administrative director, a mid-level Draxi civil servant named Torin, who had been on the colony for 6 years and had 3 children in school back on Draxi Prime, assessed the situation with a particular clarity of a person who is far from home and does not want to die there, and requested a direct communication line to his home government. Ray gave him one. She routed it through the same relay the 12 ships in orbit were using, which meant it arrived on Draxi Prime 40 minutes late. But she gave it to him. She sat in the room while he made the call, not to monitor it. She told him that, and she meant it. She sat in the room because there was nowhere else to sit, and because she thought he might want to witness to the fact that he was doing the reasonable thing. Torin spoke to his government for 6 minutes, then he sat quietly for the 40 minutes it took for the response to arrive. When it came, he listened to it. His expression during the listening was the expression of a person receiving information that confirmed something he already suspected. He closed the channel. He looked at Rai. He said in the standard trade language that most conclave species shared, my government says to maintain the administrative structure by all means available. Ray said, what are you going to do? Torin said, I have 214 staff members here who are not soldiers. I have a government that is 400 light minutes away and shrinking in influence by the hour. He paused. What I'm going to do is request safe passage for my staff to a neutral transit point. Ray said she would arrange it. He said, is there a list for this colony, like the document? She said she didn't understand the question. He said, the document that was placed on the conclave floor, the accounting, is there one for this colony for what was taken here? Rethought about the water network, the 80 years, the 400 Draxi administering a colony of 112,000 Velhari who could have isolated the administrative interfaces at any time. She said, I think Osa could make you one. Torin nodded. Slowly, he said, I would like to read it. He stopped. I don't know if that changes anything, but I would like to read it. While Rai was coordinating safe passage for administrative staff on a colony whose name nobody would remember, in the large history being written that Weak Admiral Voss was 300 light-years away, doing something that had no poetry to it at all. She was dismantling an economy, the human fleet, the full human fleet, not the 43 ships the convoy had encountered, the real one, the one built in the silence, was moving through Conclave space in a pattern that the Conclave's military command kept almost understanding and then losing, not toward the defensive lines around them, through the gaps that existed in any defensive structure that was built to stop something coming from one direction. The targets were infrastructure, transit hubs, extraction platforms, the relay stations that coordinated Conclave resource distribution across 400 systems, the administrative interfaces that 1,400 years of Conclave civilization had quietly made essential to the functioning of every economy in the member network. She was not destroying them. Destruction was slower and more expensive and created debris and had optics problems. She was doing what the Honored Ascent had taught the Conclave was possible, disabling, redirecting, taking offline, repurposing. A transit hub went from Conclave controlled to neutral in about 40 minutes under the methods her engineering teams had developed. The hub kept working. Goods kept moving. They just stopped moving through Conclave accounting systems and started moving through the new network, the one that didn't appear on Conclave charts, the one humanity and 14 allied species had been building quietly while everyone watched. Diplomatic silence, and concluded it was grief. The Conclave's military kept trying to respond and kept arriving 40 minutes after Voss had already finished and moved on. They were fighting the last position. She was already at the next one, on Draxi Prime in the inner council chamber. Bait was receiving reports faster than he could process them. Colony disruptions, infrastructure offline, trade routes redirecting, species that were supposed to be Conclave members sending messages about reviewing their status. The military commander telling him the closed fist was a plan for a war that wasn't happening. The actual war was something else, something that didn't have a name. Yet because the Conclave hadn't had to name it before, his intelligence director came in with an updated analysis. She set it on his desk. She did not say anything. He read the cover page. The cover page said that based on current trajectory modeling, the Conclave's economic infrastructure would reach critical dysfunction in approximately 90 days, not destroyed, functional but no longer the center of anything. The new network would be the center. The Conclave would be a legacy system. 90 days. VTH looked up from the page. His intelligence director was watching him. She had the look of someone who had run the numbers 3 times, hoping to get a different result. He asked her how long the new network had been under construction, and she said at minimum 12 years, possibly longer. 12 years. He thought about 12 years of sitting at tables with humans, 12 years of the Helios Compact, 12 years of petitions received and tabled and occasionally denied with careful language, 12 years of humans in the center of the room looking up at everyone around them building. His aide came in and said that the military commander was requesting authorization for an escalated response, direct engagement with human fleet elements, full combat protocols. Bait looked at the analysis on his desk. The 90-day number, the infrastructure map with its spreading gaps like a net being pulled Loose from the inside, he thought about Cesar's line, when you seat people at the children's table long enough, they start talking to each other. He looked at his aide. He said, "Get me the list of species that have filed status review requests in the last 72 hours. His aide said there were 23. Bates said, "Get me the list." He needed to understand who was still standing with him. He needed to know what the closed fist was actually holding before he told it to close. The aide left. VTH sat alone in his office, the office with the good view and the furniture from 3 different worlds and the awards on the wall from 30 years of diplomatic work he had believed in, genuinely believed in, because he had told himself that the conclave was the thing holding the galaxy together, and someone had to hold it together, and the compromises required to do that were unfortunate but necessary. He thought about Mira's reach, 14,000 people, iron tasting water, a shell company with 3 administrators and no active operations. He thought about an elderly Valhari woman who had known where every pipe was for 40 years and had not touched the isolation valves. We could have done this at any time. He sat with that for a long time. Then his aide came back with the list, and Bate read it, and the number was not 23 anymore. It was 31, and 3 of them were founding members. He read the list to the end. He set it down. Outside his window, Drakesea Prime went about its business, ordinary and unhurried, unaware that the shape of the galaxy was changing in the dark between stars, being rebuilt quietly by people who had spent a very long time learning exactly where all the pipes were. His communications panel lit up. Incoming priority channel. The origin tag read Human Unified Defense Command Director Caro Personal. VTH looked at the panel for a moment, then he reached out and accepted the channel. Maroro and LT Unk and GT. Voice was calm and without performance. He said, "Counselor VTH, I'm calling to let you know that we will accept a formal ceasefire request if the conclave wishes to submit one. A pause. One condition: the request goes to the coalition of free species, not to us. We're not the right body to negotiate with any more." VTH said, "The coalition." Maroro said, "The Velhari chair. Her name is Coordinator Essa. She's good. She'll be fair." Bates said, "You built this whole structure and then gave the chair to someone else." Maroro said, "Yes." Silence on the line. Bates said, "Why?" Maroro said, "Because this was never about us being in charge. It was about not being treated like we weren't." The line was quiet. Then Maroro said, "Submit the request. Counselor, do it before 31 becomes 40. The channel closed. VTH sat in the quiet of his office. On his desk, the analysis with the 90-day number. On the wall, 30 years of awards. On the panel, the list of 31. He reached for the communications panel. He began to draft. The station was called Meridian. It sat at the edge of human space, not quite inside it, not quite outside. A deliberate choice. The same way everything about the next 3 days had been a deliberate choice. It was not a grand station. It had been built 20 years ago as a trade and resupply hub for the outer colonies. Expanded to white, twice functional. Without being impressive, the corridors were wide enough for 4 species to walk abreast, and the atmospheric systems could handle 7 different breathing requirements, and the lighting was adjustable across a range that covered most of the conclave member species comfort zones. Humanity had chosen it because it was theirs, not a neutral site selected by committee, not a conclave facility generously offered for the occasion. Theirs built with their money, staffed by their people, maintained by their engineers, sitting in the dark. They had navigated for 300 years. The geometry of the room mattered. They had learned that a long time ago. The conclave delegation arrived first, which was also a deliberate choice. Theirs arriving first meant waiting, and waiting meant a kind of deference, and the conclave's lead negotiator had decided that projecting deference at the opening was preferable to projecting defiance that the current situation could not support. It was sound tactical thinking. It was the kind of thinking you did when you had 31 defections and a 90-day clock in a military that was 3 weeks into realizing the war it had prepared for was not the war it was in. VTH was not in the delegation. That had been a quiet decision made at the highest level of conclave leadership, the kind of decision that announced itself by the absence of the person rather than any formal statement. VTH had been the face of the Helios Compact. VTH had sent the convoy. VTH had tabled the medical petition in 2289, had signed the boundary revision, had read Cesara's research and put it in a drawer. Sending VTH to Meridian would have been a message and not the kind they wanted to send. The lead negotiator was a KAT diplomat named Sorrel. She was competent and relatively clean, relatively in the sense that all senior conclave officials had made compromises, but Sorrel's compromises had been of the smaller, more defensible kind. She had objected internally to the medical petition delay. There was a record of it. The coalition had reviewed the record. They had accepted her as the conclave's lead negotiator on that basis. She sat at the table that had been provided and looked at the room and tried not to think about the ceiling height, which was ordinary, about 4 m, the kind of ceiling that made a room feel like a room and not a demonstration. Coordinator Essa of the Velhari arrived with a delegation of 11, representing 7 species. She was not a large person. She was not by most standards a visually imposing person. She was precise in her movements and economical in her expressions. And she had spent the last 4 months building a coalition of species who had between them approximately 800 years of accumulated grievance against the conclave system, which meant she had spent 4 months listening to a very large amount of pain and finding the structural bones inside it. She sat across from Sorrel and placed her materials on the table and said, "Good morning." Sorrel said, "Good morning." They began. Admiral Voss was not at the table. She was in a secondary room off the main corridor, the kind of room that had a coffee dispenser and 3 chairs, and a window that looked out at the docking arms. She had a tablet in her hand with a live feed from the negotiating room. She was not watching it closely. She was watching the window. Her aide, a young lieutenant named Graves, was sitting in one of the other chairs trying to decide whether he was allowed to talk. He had been her aide for 2 years and had learned that the question of whether he was allowed to talk was almost always answered by whether she had acknowledged his presence when he sat down. She had not acknowledged his presence. He waited. After a while she said, 43 years, he said. Admiral, she said, that's how long ASA ran the water network on VTH's margin. 43 years before we got there. She looked at the window the whole time. She knew where the isolation valves were. Graves said nothing. He understood. This was not a conversation. It was a thing she was saying out loud that needed to be said out loud. Voss said. She never touched them. Not because she couldn't, because she was waiting for something. A pause. I want to know what she was waiting for. Graves said the right time. Voss looked at him then. Look was not unkind. No, she said she wasn't waiting for the right time. She was waiting for the right company. She went back to the window. The first day of negotiations covered the foundation framework, the legal structure by which the coalition of free species would be recognized as an independent body, the terms under which former conclave member species who had filed status reviews could transition their memberships, and the preliminary architecture of a new trade agreement that did not have the conclave's extraction logic built into its bones. Sorrel negotiated carefully and without bad faith, which Essa acknowledged by saying so directly at the end of the first session. It was an unusual thing to say, and it landed in the room with some weight. She was not being generous, she was being accurate, and the accuracy of it was its own nubs of head. Watching, we're keeping records, and when you do the right thing, we will say so. The second day was harder. The reparations framework, the accounting, the document that Voss had placed on the floor of the conclave hall 7 months ago, became the foundational text. Not an accusation in this room. A ledger, each item reviewed, each value assessed, each line item that could be addressed in practical terms, given a practical path. The medical petition of 2289, 11,000 lives. No number made that right. Essa did not try to find a number. She proposed instead a standing medical access protocol, permanent and binding, with automatic override provisions that could not be tabled by procedural motion. Sorrel accepted it. The first 10 minutes of the session, the Helios Compact Tariff Structure, 8 trillion credits over 40 years, a full reversal, was not practical. Money spent over 4 decades on conclave projects did not simply come back. What ESSA proposed was a 20-year reinvestment structure, a portion of conclave trade revenue redirected toward colonial infrastructure and species that had been net contributors under the compact. It was less than the full accounting. It was more than nothing. It was, Essa said, a beginning. Sorrel said she would need to consult with the conclave council. Essa said she had 48 hours. Sorrel said that was not much time. Essa said the colony on Mira's Reach has been waiting 14 years for water rights that were theirs for 60 years before. That 48 hours is generous. Sorrel did not argue. The human delegation was present in the room during negotiations, seated along the wall rather than at the table. Observers, technically everyone in the room, understood that the weight of their presence was not technical. Voss came into the room on the second day and sat at the end of the observer row and watched. She did not speak. She did not need to. There was a quality to her stillness that was different from patience. Patience implied waiting for something. She had already arrived. This stillness was something else. The stillness of a person who had done the work and was now watching the work become real. Cesar was in the room too. She had come on the coalition's shuttle. Essa had invited her personally, which was a thing that did not need explanation. Cesara had sat in the conclave rooms for a long time. she had earned a different seat. She was sitting 3 chairs down from Voss on the observer row, halfway through the second session during a recess while Sorrel consulted with her secondary team. Voss looked down the row and found Asara looking at her. They held the look for a moment. No words. There were no words that would have added anything. The look said what it said. I told them you knew. It happened. Anyway, here we are. All of it in the space between 2 people, sitting in a room with an ordinary ceiling watching the thing get done. Sarah nodded once small. Voss nodded back. The recess ended and the session resumed. Sorrel returned on the 3rd morning with the Conclave Council's response on the reinvestment structure. They had made 3 amendments. 2 of them were reasonable adjustments to the timeline. One of them was an attempt to redefine the category of species eligible for reinvestment in a way that would have excluded 4 of the 7 coalition species from the framework entirely. Essa read the amendment. She set it down. She looked at Sorrel. Sorrel said, I want to be clear that I recommended against that amendment. Essa said, I believe you. She picked up the document and drew a single line through the amendment with a physical pen, which was an old gesture from an old tradition, and landed in the room with the weight of its age. The other 2 I'll accept. This one doesn't exist. Sorrel said the council will object. ESSA said the council can file the objection with the review board under Article 7 of the new framework, which will take it up at the next scheduled session. A pause in 6 months. Sorrel looked at the line through the amendment, then she looked at ESSA, then she signed. She signed the way someone signs a thing they understand is real and final, not the way VTH would have signed it. Bate would have signed it, looking for the exit for the clause he'd use later for the procedural motion that would undo it in 18 months. Sorrel signed it looking at what it was. An accounting, a beginning, a document, in a room with an ordinary ceiling that did not need to make anyone feel small. The session ended. Marrero got the confirmation in Geneva at 3:00 in the morning local time. His communications director had forwarded it immediately, rather than waiting for his morning briefing, because she had correctly assessed that he would want to know. He was at his desk, which was where he had been for most of the last 3 months. He read the confirmation once, sat with it. He pulled up the status file on Mira's Reach, the colony water infrastructure project, the one funded through the 3 intermediary channels, the one the colony thought was a humanitarian organization. The file showed 94% completion, 3 weeks out from full operational status. He sent a message to the project coordinator, one line: when the last pipe is in, tell them where the money came from. He closed the file. He looked at his office, the window with the ordinary city view, the desk, the files, the work, everything that had been here for 20 years, while the list got built and the silence was planned, and the fleet was grown and the roots were laid and the allies were found in the children's table conversations nobody had been paying attention to. He thought about Asa. He had read Ray's report on VTH's margin. He had read the part about the isolation valves and the translation device, and we could have done this at any time, and had sat with it for a long time. He thought about all the asses, all the species that had kept their hands off their valves while they waited for something he couldn't name precisely. Not a rescuer, not a permission, not Even justice, something more like. Company, the right company. He turned off his desk light. The window showed the city outside, dark and ordinary and alive, going about its 3 in the morning. Business, somewhere out there, people were sleeping in homes they had built and drinking water from pipes they had laid, and living lives the size of lives, not the size of history. The history was done. The lives were what it was for. 3 weeks and 2 days later, a maintenance worker on Mira's Reach colony drove the last pipe fitting into a connection point in a distribution hub on the edge of the settlement, and the flow sensor registered green for the first time on the new system, and the worker called the hub supervisor, who called the colony administrator, who called a meeting that night in the common hall. That 3 yarders of the colony's 14,000 residents attended. The colony administrator stood up and explained the water rights restoration, the legal order, the formal return of the aquifer claims, the Drakesy Shell Company's registration canceled and the rights formally reverted, and the room was noisy. For a while, the way rooms are noisy. When people receive news, they stop letting themselves hope for. Then she explained the infrastructure funding. The organization she had believed was humanitarian, where it had actually come from. The room went quiet, not the quiet of shock, the quiet of a thing landing with full weight in a space where people had been carrying something heavy for a long time. Someone near the back asked what they were supposed to do with that. The administrator said she didn't know. She said maybe nothing. She said maybe that was the point, that they didn't owe anything, that the water was theirs, that it had always been theirs, and that the funding was not a favor but a debt being acknowledged. A woman near the front, who had lived on the colony for 31 years and remembered when the iron taste started, asked if she could see the document, the list, the one that started all of it. Someone pulled it up on a shared display in the room, read it together slowly, all the items, all the dates, the names, the numbers. They read the last item, their colony, their aquifer, their 60 years of terraforming, a shell company, 3 administrators, no active operations. They read the last line, this table is closed. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Then the woman near the front turned on the tap at the small sink mounted on the community hall wall. It had run on the old restricted supply for years, and they had always left it connected more as a reminder than anything useful. And the water came through clean and cold, and without the taste of iron, and she cupped her hands under it and drank, and did not say anything at all. She did not need to, neither did anyone else. Outside, the colony went about its night. Lights in the windows, the sound of settlement, the ordinary noise of 14,000 people living on a world they had grown from bare rock and would not give up. The stars were thick above the dome, and the aquifer was full under the ground, and the pipes were new, and the water ran clean. It tasted like nothing like water should, like theirs.